Though it was years in the making, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 occurred rather suddenly, and in its immediate aftermath, the Russian people hoped for freedom. Sadly, their hopes were not fulfilled. So, today we're going to take a look at what really happened right after the collapse of the USSR. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other political topics you would like to hear about. Okay, time for a story of crime and punishment, war and peace, and probably some other really long books by Dostoevsky. If one thing symbolized Western freedom more than anything else in Russian eyes, it was a pair of blue jeans. And it is difficult to argue with that definition. Jeans may have been ordinary for Americans, but to Russians, they were a glimpse into a world beyond the Iron Curtain. A genuine pair of Levi's would command a huge price in the Soviet Union, where there was a vibrant underground market in counterfeit denim. The black market always had your back, or your buns in this case. Even Russian propaganda pieces highlighting the dire poverty in American inner cities couldn't hide the fact that even the poorest Americans could still afford a pair of jeans that a Russian engineer would have to forsake a month's salary for, which had to sting. So, when the Soviet Union collapsed, ordinary Russian people yearned for a flood of real denim and other Western goods, and the freedom they promised. But as is usually the case, the reality wasn't nearly as good as the dream. The luxuries of the West were slow to come, stores emptied, and millions were plunged into dire poverty. The Russian mafia has a long history that stretches back to the days of the Tsar and several James Bond movies. Under Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 1980s, around 800 criminal gangs operated in Russia. They mostly dealt in the black market, bringing in Western contraband, like those coveted blue jeans, but otherwise kept a fairly low profile. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the number of gangs exploded tenfold by the mid-1990s. The mafia eagerly filled the power vacuum the fall of communism created. The ranks of criminal gangs swelled, with ex-KGB agents and military veterans returning from Afghanistan. There was a surplus of skilled muscle with no other options. Or in other words, violence had never been cheaper. A hit in the 90s could be carried out for as little as $1,000 American, roughly the cost of a plane ticket to Disneyland. And at that price, who could afford not to have your enemy killed? Wonder if they had bulk rates, or maybe a kind of fast pass. Predictably, the cemeteries began to fill with the graves of slain mob bosses. Also, the lifting of certain restrictions allowed ordinary Russians to open their own businesses, which in turn gave the syndicate a steady stream of protection money. More businesses means more people to shake down. The government estimated that in 1994, about 40% of private businesses and 60% of state businesses were controlled by the mafia. The vast majority of banks were also under criminal control, although that probably didn't affect the general public as much. I mean, is there really a difference between Wells Fargo and Dmitry No-Nose Popovich? Think about it. At the lowest levels of society, young gopniks picked clean the pockets of passerbys. At the upper levels, unscrupulous officials attempted to profit from the sale of Soviet hardware to anyone willing to buy it. There was even an infamous attempt to sell a submarine to the Colombian cartel. It was a tough time for everyone, except for criminals and Hollywood screenwriters. In fairness, that submarine deal would make a pretty rad movie. The collapse of the USSR brought about one of the fastest transfers of wealth in human history, at least until Jeff Bezos invented a bookstore, but online. At the time, the vast reserves of petroleum, natural gas, and metal deposits were ripe for plunder, and a tiny number of Russians were well poised to take full advantage of the situation. The transfer of state assets into private hands for a pittance was supposed to make their operation more efficient and prevent a reversion to communism. While that might have worked, it effectively just wound up trading communist oligarchs for business oligarchs. In fact, 3 distinct groups of oligarchs rose. The first was the factory directors, who used their position to assume ownership of the facilities they once ran. The other 2 groups, by far the biggest profiteers, were known as the nomenklatura and the non-nomenklatura oligarchs. Gonna need a cheat sheet for all these oligarchs. The nomenklatura were ex-Soviet elites who assumed control of the assets they once managed in the USSR. For example, Viktor Chernomyrdin went from the minister of gas production to the head of the world's largest natural gas company, presumably adding several more garages to his mansion in the process. The non-nomenklatura oligarchs were outside of the traditional circles of power in the USSR. but had black market experience and, crucially, the means to raise large amounts of capital as bank owners to take full advantage of the fire sale. These guys funded the ailing Russian government in exchange for temporary stakes in state assets. Should the government default on those loans, those temporary shares would become permanent, which of course is exactly what happened. What was supposed to kickstart the new market economy only served to enrich a small number of Russians, while sharply contracting the economy at large. Russia went from having not a single millionaire in 1991 to 17 billionaires by the early 2000s. Welcome to the West, comrades. For many ordinary Russians, economic liberalization had some very hard consequences. The lifting of price controls without a functioning commercial sector quickly drove up the cost of everyday essentials, and the ensuing inflation meant savings people had carefully built for years, or even decades, soon became worthless. For millions of Russians, the early reforms brought about a sharp decline in their standard of living, and the purchasing power of their salaries was cut in half. So much for blue jeans. The ruble's value was so volatile that many transactions and savings were done with US dollars. Desperate to get by, the Russian people became especially vulnerable to scams, such as the MMM Cooperative, one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history. As Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin put it in 1993, "We wanted the best, but it turned out like always." Nice pep talk, coach. Real inspiring, that prime minister. Boris Yeltsin emerged as an unlikely hero during the dying days of the Soviet Union, when he helped thwart an attempted coup in August of 1991. We like to imagine that he did this like John McClane in Die Hard, alone, barefoot and crawling through the ductwork to the Kremlin. So we're not going to look into that any further. Regardless of how he pulled it off, his ensuing popularity made him well positioned to take over from Mikhail Gorbachev and lead Russia into the immediate post-communism years. To facilitate Russia's transition from a planned economy to a market economy, he requested and received extraordinary powers to facilitate the transformation. He was essentially given carte blanche for a year to enact what he called economic shock therapy. That sounds kind of terrifying, but he believed drastic reforms were necessary to reshape the economy. The catch was, the international funding needed to pull it off was conditional. Money would only be released if Russia deeply cut spending. Yeltsin promised his people that the painful reforms were necessary, and after 6 difficult months, Russia would be reborn as an economic titan. But it was a promise he could not keep. After a year, there was no sign of the promised prosperity. The deep cuts to social spending had a high human and political cost. Rather than grow the economy as hoped, the controversial reforms shrank it considerably and plunged huge swaths of the population into poverty. Yeltsin's popularity flatlined as politicians and the public demanded accountability. Vice President Alexander Vyratsky even decried the reforms as economic genocide. Apparently, this economic shock therapy was the one flew over the cuckoo's nest variety. As you might imagine, economic genocide wasn't a terribly popular policy, so the Russian parliament sought to curb Yeltsin's power and slow down the controversial reforms, which put Yeltsin on the defensive. After months of gridlock, he finally issued Decree number 1400, the dissolution of parliament and the abolition of the constitution. Basically, he put a burn notice on Russia's brand new government. The US even tentatively backed his move. 2 days later, a special session of parliament voted to impeach the president, but their ruling was ignored as power and water were cut off from the building. Violent clashes between the police and anti-Yeltsin demonstrators broke out in Moscow. The standoff ended in October when Yeltsin ordered the military to storm the building. Russia's White House was shelled, and the uprising came to a definitive end. In the aftermath, substantial presidential powers were enshrined in law that continued to be exercised to the present day. Chechnya is a small state in the Caucasus that attempted to gain independence after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. Fearing other states would follow and secede from the Russian Federation, and looking for an easy military victory to bolster his sagging public support, Yeltsin ordered an invasion of Chechnya in December of 1994. What was supposed to be a cakewalk, however, became a humiliating nightmare. Why does that sound familiar? The unexpectedly fierce Chechen resistance and widespread opposition to the conflict forced the Russian troops to withdraw in 1997, just in time for Spice World. Under the terms of the peace deal, Chechnya remained part of Russia, but was effectively independent. A second conflict would break out in 1991 as a spate of terrorist attacks in Moscow were blamed on the Chechens. After Yeltsin left office at the end of 1999, the war effort would continue as his chosen successor, Vladimir Putin, upped the ante. Yeah, you knew he was going to show up. More on him in a bit. Combat operations closed by May 2000, but the insurgency took almost a decade to put down. A pro-Russian government was installed and the state was reincorporated into Russia. As Russia's economy gradually recovered from the difficult beginning of the 1990s, a new crisis was just around the corner. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 had a knock-on effect in Russia. The major economic downturn of several East Asian countries resulted in a sharp reduction in the price of oil, which fell to a low of just $11 per barrel. Is that right? $11? How can you afford not to buy a barrel of oil? You could use it as a nightstand, a bar stool. You could stand on it and play banjo. It could be the fulcrum on a seesaw. If it gets that cheap again, I'm all over that. Because billionaires tend to be tax-averse, the vast fortunes of the oligarchs were stashed offshore, and attempts to clamp down on tax evasion only made it worse. Meanwhile, the disastrous conflict with Chechnya only further depleted the state's coffers. By the fall of 1998, the Russian government began to default on domestic debts while remaining current on international obligations. The value of the ruble tumbled, and millions of Russians were paid late or not at all as the crisis deepened. Inflation soared from a painful 35% at the end of 1998 to an utterly ruinous 85% the following year. It's not too surprising to learn that a majority of Russians aren't nearly as nostalgic for the 90s as Americans. As Littlefinger from Game of Thrones aptly put it, chaos is a ladder, and the chaotic conditions of the 1990s were highly favorable to the rise of a new breed of political operative. For example, the fortunes of one former mid-level KGB officer turned suddenly with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin was a 17-year veteran of the agency who began his political career working for the first democratically elected mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak. Putin became one of Sobchak's most trusted aides and garnered a reputation for getting things done. When Sobchak was narrowly defeated in the 1996 election, Putin refused the offer of employment with the next administration, reportedly stating, "It's better to be hanged for loyalty than to be rewarded for betrayal." That's some foreshadowing. It's like Chekhov's gun, if instead of it on the wall, it was in the pocket of a former KGB agent turned Russian politician. In 1998, Putin became the head of the FSB, the successor agency to the KGB. As Yeltsin's administration toiled under the weight of the Chechen War and the economic crisis, the idea of a strong, fierce leader who could restore order was powerful. By the fall of 1999, Putin was appointed prime minister. He became acting president just a few months later, when Yeltsin suddenly resigned on New Year's Eve, 1999. Putin's first moves as president were to consolidate his power. He saw how much his predecessor depended on the influence of the oligarchs, and was determined to not fall under their sway. He offered a simple deal. They would be allowed to keep their ill-gotten gains, and he would turn a blind eye to their affairs, if they would stay out of politics completely. It worked, and Putin has been large and in charge ever since, as evidenced by the many photos in which he has posed wearing blue jeans. So what do you think? Should more have been done to help Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.